Good evening. I think most of you know me anyway, but I'm Torsten Haag, the director of the Glasgow City Heritage Trust, and welcome to tonight's lecture. My good old friend Peter Burman is going to speak about one of his passion, Philip Webb, and hopefully will be very interesting. Most of you know that we have a big conference going on tomorrow, and I believe quite a few of you will be there anyway. So I suspect that's probably why it's a bit emptier today than usual, because in the last half year, certainly most events have been fully booked, and certainly tomorrow's conference is completely booked. So if you have any friends, I'm afraid it's too late now for them to get any tickets. It's gone. You might have also noticed that we have a new events a leaflet, which is from May to August now. So this is the events we're having, and everything starting with today's event is under the label of Gilded Age, which is all about the glamour and grit of Glasgow, how decorated arts in Glasgow influenced actually the whole world. You will find there's a whole series of events going on. Tonight's lecture is the introduction to it. Tomorrow we have a long concert. The next event is about an organ recital for the newly restored Father Willis organ in Courtiers on the 20th of May. And there's very many events planned for the rest of the year under that kind of label of Gilded Age, and hopefully future years as well, because we really want to raise the profile of Glasgow as one of the major influences on worldwide on decorative arts, and the wealth from the industrial richness which created the decorative arts. But just under this context, introduction, Peter is going to speak and say a bit more about himself and what he wants to say, and I'll go over to Peter.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So,
I think this is the third time I've given a talk in this room, and it's such a friendly size and shape, isn't it? So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity of speaking about my ultimate hero, bar one. I have to say that because I think my real ultimate hero has to be John Ruskin, whom Philip Webb also greatly admired. And Ruskin admired him too. And in a famous, very short letter to a mutual friend of theirs, he recommended Webb as an architect who could do work of very good quality at very reasonable price. Ruskin wasn't always so practical, as we know. And I've just been in London for 2 days, and my great treat there was to buy a new book on Ruskin's daguerreotype. I don't know if the rest of you have seen it. It came out very, very recently, and I read a review of it in Apollo, and it's enormously heavy and enormously extravagant, but I just had to have it because Ruskin was one of the first great recorders of historic buildings, and also, as we know, through his study of Venice, perhaps the first person who ever made a really deep study of an entire city as an organism with wonderful architecture. And here in Glasgow and also in Edinburgh, where I live, we have these organisms somewhat at risk through overdevelopment, as I was also witnessing in Mayfair in London only yesterday. So I think in the blurb that has been circulated, it says that I've been studying Webb for a long time, which is true. And I just looked inside. This is one of my great treasures too. This is the book published in 1935 by William Richard Letherby called Philip Webb and His Work. And at the front it says, Peter Burman, York, October 1995. Well, that's quite a long time ago, isn't it? But actually I was searching for a copy of this book for years. So my interest in Webb certainly began before that. And he's, I think, able to be a hero for us all for more than one reason. He was a very interesting architect, but he was also a great campaigner for historic buildings in a very practical way, as I'll hope to reveal to you. But the one thing most people know about him is represented by my first image on the screen, which is the house that he designed for William and Jane Morris, Red House in Bexley Heath. It'd be very interesting to know how many of you have actually been there. 3. plus me 4. Well, there's plenty of potential, isn't there, clearly, in the room. After my talk, Torsten says we'll all go. Well, that would be a very good idea. And before the National Trust took it over, it was vested in a small charitable trust. And I was actually a trustee of it for whatever it was, 5 or 6 years. And before that, it belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Ted Hollamby. Ted was an architect and planner in Lambeth Planning Department, and then, of course, later in retirement. But he and his wife really loved Red House, and they kept it afloat during what might have been a difficult time. And he was very keen to hand it on. And it is a great solution, I think, that the National Trust recognised its extreme importance as one of the key houses of the 19th century. And they do present it very well, and I shall say a bit more about it later. So you can ignore the words because I'll say something similar to them, or or complementary to them. But for many, many years, I found Webb such a sympathetic human being. And one of the things that I like a lot about him is that, unlike, for example, his very close contemporary, I may be about to have a middle-aged moment and forget whom I intended to mention, but that doesn't really matter. But some of his contemporaries were very publicity conscious in the way that some distinguished architects, mentioning no names, can be today. But he was not like that at all. He had to have things coaxed out of him. But I think he's been very fortunate, as I've said there, in those who have written about him. And Letherby was a disciple of his, and he wrote about him with great feeling and sensitivity. And also there's a really good modern book, which some of you I'm sure will know, by Sheila Kirk. And in 1996, she and I collaborated together in organising a conference about Philip Webb and his circle, but mostly about Philip Webb himself, at the University of York, where I then was. And it was a very happy time, and I believe that it's the only conference there has ever been about Philip Webb. And it was great fun because we had a day of papers, and I'm not the only person in the room who contributed one, which is nice too. And then we had a day of outings, and then a day of papers, and then a day of outings. And this is a very wonderful way of having a conference when it's, as it were, locked into reality and not just into a conference or lecture room. And this is one of the illustrations in Letherby's book. Remember, it's 1935, so it has a certain old-fashioned charm to it. And this is the house called Caxton's, to which Webb retired in 1901. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. And Thomas Matthews Rooke, with an E on the end, was part of Philip Webb's circle. There are some charming watercolours by him, including one of Webb in retirement, sitting in the kitchen of Caxton's. Incidentally, a rather peculiar characteristic of the arts and crafts movement is that we often refer to people by both their Christian names. So I often think of and say Philip Speakman Webb, his mother was a Speakman, or William Richard Letherby. And a very good new friend of mine who is editing Webb's letters in 4 volumes. They're going to be published in December. I call John James Aplin because, he is John James. But there we are. There is Thomas Matthews Rooke, just after Webb's death, actually, recording Caxton's. Apparently it was that photograph taken just after Webb died in 1915. And of course we are celebrating, or commemorating rather, his centenary this year. And to kick it off, I wrote an article about him in the SPAB, Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings magazine, in the spring last year. And I gave the lecture I'm giving you, this is only the second time I've given it, to kick off a series of lectures in London about different aspects of Webb. And I think he is really, could be, a hero for all of us. He was a very, very special person indeed. So, as I told you that in my view, Letherby writes about Webb with great sensitivity and judgment. And I love this paragraph. I write not because I can judge Philip Webb, but rather than in his life I find a means of judging my own. I feel very much like that myself. Webb was one of the typical, and I believe, great Victorians. He did or tried to do for building what Browning attempted for poetry, to revitalise it by returning to contact with reality. My subject, as I see it, is the architect as hero. And architect as hero is where I get the title for this lecture from. And by returning to contact with reality, those are my italics, as editors or authors often say. And what was that reality? It was about building as a part to styles. And Webb was absolutely passionate about what we call nowadays vernacular building, traditions, skills, materials. And if he was asked to design a house, or more rarely a church or other building, he spent weeks in the neighbourhood looking at the local buildings, looking at how local building materials were used, and trying to design and work in that tradition and work with local craftsmen. Though he also employed sometimes a particular big London firm of contractors who had all the skills at a very high level. And you're seeing two images of Webb. The one on the left belongs to the National Portrait Gallery in London and is one of three painted by Charles Fairfax Murray, who was very much part of Webb's circle in 1873. And the image on the right, you're among the very few people ever to see, because it is locked in the archives of Castle Howard, where I first came across it. And Simon Howard, the present head of the family, is very, very chary of letting images be published, but he has allowed me to use this in my Philip Webb lecture this year. And as you see, it's a very sensitive and beautiful drawing. And apparently, as I've said there, it's by the Honourable George Howard, who later became the 9th Earl of Carlisle and inherited the Castle Howard and Naworth Castle estates. He was an extremely good artist, not just an amateur, but a really, really fine artist. And one of the things he liked to do when people came and stayed the weekend, and Webb did sometimes do that, both at Castle Howard and Naworth, is he liked to draw his friends. So these portraits have a lot of affection in them. And I actually have one myself, because when I left the University of York to come to Scotland in 2002, a group of my friends clubbed together and bought a drawing by the 9th Earl and gave it me as a present. And I'm not very keen on carrying it about, but I wish I'd thought of bringing it to you this evening. But his pencil drawings are very beautiful. The left-hand portrait, I often think that Webb looks rather like a clergyman. I could imagine him being the dean of a great cathedral, and he had a lot to do with cathedrals as an architect. And one of his brothers was a canon of Winchester Cathedral, and another brother was a doctor in Hertfordshire, and he designed a house for him. So he had connections with the other historic professions, except perhaps the law. So here I've tried to define what returning to contact with reality meant in Letherby's mind, and I've virtually told you what I think it means, but I chose these words rather carefully. So paying real attention to local vernacular ways of building, using local materials, also honouring the craftsmen and their skills, avoiding historical styles as such, Gothic, classical, Baroque, whatever they might be, while using elements of them where appropriate, avoiding ostentation, relating buildings to their landscapes. That's very important. Here at Standen, to which I expect some of you have been or may have been, which now also belongs to the National Trust, he persuaded the solicitor and his wife, who had bought this relatively small estate and wanted not a country house in the sense of a house that was the head house of an estate, as a comfortable place to live when they at weekends in the country. And they had actually chosen the site for their house, and they had also decided to demolish this rather fine 15th century Wealden farmhouse. And Webb, with his great patient eloquence, persuaded them to excavate into a quarry and nestle the house in a bit of a hollow instead of being quite so prominent. And he also persuaded them to keep the 15th century Wealden farmhouse, and he turned it into apartments, 2 apartments, one for the butler and the other for the chauffeur. And it's a rather remarkable example, I think, perhaps one of the most vivid from that time, of a good vernacular building being incorporated into a wider architectural context, a fine country house. Another of Lethaby's introductory remarks is that Webb was a member of the later pre-Raphaelite group, the post-Ruskinite group it might be called. Its architectural member. Of course, they were mostly painters and one sculptor. One of the founders of the firm of Morris and Company, which very few people remember, and the intimate friend of William Morris. The two men worked together so closely and influenced one another so much that they can hardly be separated. And I find it very fruitful to remember that he was part of that very creative circle, the second generation of pre-Raphaelites, most of whom were painters and all of whom were deeply interested in craftsmanship and the traditional crafts, including building crafts. And I show there another member of it, Edward Burne-Jones, who, like Webb, was also closely involved with Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, as it was originally called, and later on Morris and Company. And Webb continued to design for Morris and Company. It would be a whole lecture in itself to discuss with you what he did, but I especially associate him with furniture, some very fine pieces of furniture. I especially associate him with stained glass. If you've looked at Morris and Company windows, you will have noticed they have peculiarly fine lettering, white on black, which apparently Webb designed. And he often had overall control over the design of a big window, and perhaps Burne-Jones and Morris himself and one or two of the other artist members of the firm or the circle would have designed some of the other figures. On the right, I show the Kelmscott Press Chaucer, because an interest in typography was also something that Webb shared with Morris. And I think it's interesting that when the Kelmscott Press, which preoccupied a lot of the 10 years of Morris's life, he died in 1896, one of the few people who got a free copy of every publication was Webb. And he was apparently faintly embarrassed by this. I only know this because John James Aplin is sharing all the letters with me as he edits them. And he insisted on buying a copy of every book as it came out as well. And he left or gave his set, the set that Morris gave him, to Trinity College Library in Cambridge, which was a very, very generous thing to do. So much later on, in this book that I have here, Lethaby tells the story of the founding of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Monuments, or Buildings rather, in April 1877. And at the very first meeting, Morris, Webb and George Wardle was Morris's manager at the firm's headquarters in London, were asked to draw up a manifesto which to this day guides the Society's ethics and its casework. And I know that to be true because I've been a committee member of the SPAB on and off for 42 years, and I was sitting on the committee only the day before yesterday in London. And we often use the manifesto as a litmus paper in deciding how to react to particular proposals. And in the middle there, I quote one of the most famous and wonderful passages. I think I might actually read it briskly because it is just so beautiful, and it is the foundation of so much in our British approach to the care of historic monuments. Because Ruskin wrote that it is in the golden stain of time that we look for the real light and colour and preciousness of architecture. He described restoration as the most total destruction which a building can suffer. He reminded us that in an old building there is some life, some mysterious suggestion of what it had been and of what it had lost. And I so often see that in old buildings. And instead of restoration, he urged an alternative. He said, take proper care of your monuments and you will not need to restore them. A few sheets of lead put in time upon the roof, a few dead leaves and sticks swept in time out of a watercourse will save both roof and walls from ruin. Watch an old building with an anxious care, guard it as best you may, and at any cost from every influence of dilapidation. And the manifesto that they came up with leans very heavily on Ruskin. And they actually wrote him a letter saying, do you mind if we more or less quote you? And I've held in my hands Ruskin's reply. It's normally kept at the bank, but it was taken out so that I could see it with my own eyes. So Ruskin, as I've said at the very beginning, he does lie behind the arts and crafts movement, and particularly the arts and crafts architects' views of what they often called old work, old buildings. And I find it so moving that this attitude to old buildings is still part of our living daily life today. And at the SPAB, we every year appoint scholars and fellows, young architects or now also engineers, and young craftsmen and conservators. And they have this fantastic opportunity of living together for 9 months and very privileged access to special places and special people. And anyway, they were working last August on some churches in Roxburghshire, and I went and spent a day with them, and that's Roger Curtis of Historic Scotland, top left. And he demonstrated so many interesting things that day, but in his car he always carries some weed killer. And he said, you know, looking after ruined structures like this is as much about gardening as it is about building. And it's very practical, that, isn't it? And so, as you see here in the top right-hand photograph, that's exactly what he's doing. I think you could even see his canister of weed inhibitor. But I think you can also see in these photographs, particularly perhaps the two lowest photographs, which are of the scholars and fellows, that they are irradiated with passion and with love for these old buildings. And they had spent a whole week working on this particular church. And on this last day, we went round and visited some others together, analysing their problems and thinking about how to look after them. So a very brief biography of Webb. He was born in 1831. And as I mentioned there, we've got a blog going, which I write twice a month. And we're keeping going all year. So that hopefully, as a result of this centenary commemoration, more people will know about Webb, who at the present moment don't. And I show you two buildings in Oxford, which we know he knew particularly well. On the left-hand side is the Ashmolean Museum, and Webb's parents and his siblings lived in a house immediately opposite. And so Webb apparently looked out of his bedroom window and watched it being built, a masterpiece by Charles Robert Cockerell. And then on the right is the Museum of Natural History in Oxford, which Ruskin was one of the main protagonists of. And as you see, it's in a kind of Venetian Gothic style. And I do find it very interesting, and I've mentioned this already, that part of Webb's finding a new direction was to try to become independent of style. He even sometimes used the word a-stylar, in his letters, although he was perfectly happy to have sash windows and some other elements sometimes of classical style and occasionally Gothic. But he felt that people like George Edmund Street, for whom he worked for several years, had gone off in not a very good direction by immersing themselves in what we call today the Gothic revival, using historical Gothic styles. His father was a GP, as I mentioned, a brother also was a GP, and apparently little Philip Webb liked to go with his father on his rounds, and they went on horseback. Horse-related heritage is another of my great interests, and I so often think that, you know, if we could imagine ourselves back 100 years, how totally dependent we would be on the horse in a way that's unimaginable today, except that most of us are one way or another in thrall to the internal combustion engine. So I suppose it's something similar, really. But at Hopetoun, where I'm also a trustee, about a third of the house was devoted to the horse, one way or another. It's extraordinarily difficult to recapture. And Webb loved horses. He was an extremely good rider all his life, and he drew animals and birds beautifully. And so I just show you two examples, the fox and the raven, which were his drawings for one of the most famous of Morris's tapestries, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the fox and the raven. And he also took a special pleasure in designing stables. And if you ever go to a Webb house, that's Standen, bottom left, with the stable courtyard in the foreground and a detail of it on the right, you will see that they're designed in a very practical way, and also one senses with a good deal of affection. Of course, like stable blocks everywhere, and as at Clouds, often considered to be his greatest house, though not very intact, they've often been converted into living accommodation or other purposes. But nevertheless, designing stables was something he did peculiarly well, and I'm currently researching and writing an article on Webb and the stable, or Webb and the accommodation of horses. Another thing it's worth knowing about him is this great love of Oxford, which Letherby writes about, and I'll just share with you this quotation at the bottom there. He wrote to Letherby well after his retirement in 1911, that you should have been called to Oxford several times of late in duty bound touched me. For that place is mine, and I am of it, with all its cranks and corners and passages still in my mind. And you went to St. Thomas's, its neighbour the castle and its monster beauty of a keep, also the mill and the threads of water thereby, must have held you astounded. Now, I was brought up on the King James Bible and the 1662 prayer book, and I often hear echoes of these in Webb's language. Don't you think that's beautiful? Its neighbour the castle and its monster beauty of a keep, also the mill and the threads of water thereby. It almost could have come from the Psalms. It's so deeply embedded in 17th century language that. I show the other two images because rather astonishingly, Oxford Castle is now a rather smart Malmaison hotel. But when I was on the Heritage Lottery Fund's Historic Buildings and Land panel, which I was for a few years, it was one of my cases. And when I went on the visit, of course, nobody knew it was going to become a hotel, but I asked my minder to shut the door of one of the cells because I wanted to feel how it felt. And it was very unpleasant, so I was soon saying, "Let me out, please." But anyway, as you see, it's now astonishingly smart in that middle photograph. At the other end of smartness is this extraordinary and, I believe, very, very fine row of houses in Shoreditch, on the edge of the city of London. And when I go to SPAB committee meetings, as on Monday, I deliberately walk that way, coming from Old Street Underground Station. It's in a street with a wonderful name, Worship Street. And it's a row of shops with workshops behind and apartments above, dating from the early 1860s. And here are Webb's beautiful drawings. They're always very carefully annotated about materials and other subtleties. And I am just so shocked by the way in which this row of buildings has been neglected over the years. And around it is some of the most rumbustious development going on the edge of the city, because the city is ever greedy. And there's a big campaign going on at the moment about an area called Norton Folgate, which is part of Spitalfields. And this is the other side of Bishopsgate. But it is just tragic the way it's being neglected by a developer who has bought it, no doubt hoping that at a certain point it'll reach that tipping point where he might just possibly get permission to demolish it and replace it with another very tall building. So I really feel impassioned to share this building with you. I think it's wonderful, and it could so easily be nursed back into a more fruitful life. So what happened to him? He grew up in Oxford. He had very warm relationships with his parents and his siblings, and his father suddenly died rather young, and so he was apprenticed to become an architect to a man called John Billing, who was in Reading. And in those days, apparently, Reading was a really lovely market town, quite different from how it is nowadays, a rather convenient dormitory to London, with a great deal of modern development. And this man, John Billing, designed some very good new buildings, which are still extant in and around Reading, but he also did a lot of repair work to churches, especially rectories and vicarages and farms, farmhouses and farm buildings. And Webb learnt both the philosophy and the practice from him of what I like to call repair by building. And this is an extreme example of something that Webb became an advocate of, and I use it because it is so extreme. But you see, if you take out stones from areas of decayed stonework, you often do a great deal of damage in the process. So his idea was that instead of taking things out, you would build things in. And so this, using brick or tiles, is a common method of repairing ancient stonework, which disturbs the original stonework as little as possible. As I say, this is an extreme example of it because it looks rather pimply, because it's so insistent, but often it's used with much greater subtlety than that, and much fewer areas, and then I think it's very, very acceptable and an alternative to stone replacement. So then Webb spent a mere 4 weeks working in Wolverhampton for a firm called Bidlake and Lovett. W.H. Bidlake was a very fine West Midlands architect. I know his work quite well because I grew up in rural Warwickshire, and my own parish church where I was a choir boy, the tower was designed by him, and it's a magnificent tower. But apparently it gave Webb the experience of seeing how people were exploited in the workplace, in factories and workshops, and it gave him a real passion for what at that time they called socialism, which by our standards would be a rather modest version of socialism. This wonderful man here, John Brandon Jones, encouraged me in studying Philip Webb, and he had been given many wonderful documents, letters, drawings, photographs that had come down through Webb's two executors, who were Sidney Cockerell, who became director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and oh dear, I'm going to have another middle-aged moment. Sir Emery Walker, the typographer who was crucial in the Kelmscott press, and John loved to share these things, and that's a photograph I took of him during the time when I went very often on a Saturday, and we would have a coffee together, and then he just let me loose, so to speak, in his study. And then at lunchtime I had to tell him what I'd found. And one day he said, well, what have you found today? And I said, you know, that drawer that we hadn't looked in for a long time, and I thought I'd go through that this morning. And I found in it an envelope with a black border with Philip Webb's handwriting on it, and it said, notes for a talk on socialism to be given at the Conway Hall in Red Lion Square, which still exists in Holborn. So we opened it and read it together, and it was really passionate and really interesting stuff. And so we thought, well, he wasn't just being polite to William Morris, his great friend. He really was convinced that we needed a more equal society. Very relevant tonight, isn't it, on the evening of election day? Astonishing that I should be saying this sort of thing. Anyway, after we'd looked at it together, he said, and he was a very generous man, he said, put it in your pocket, dear boy. And I said, what do you mean, John? And he said, what I said. He said, I've been given all these things, and I know I'm not supposed to give them away, but sometimes I don't see why I shouldn't. So I possess this talk by Philip Webb in his own handwriting, and a few other little treasures too, but I particularly treasure that one, and I also particularly treasure the occasion and him commanding me to put it in my pocket. And I used always to have it in my pocket when I gave a talk on Webb, and now I've become an archivist. I feel that probably I ought not to do that, so I don't. Anyway, Webb went then, or rather came back to Oxford, where he had the great good fortune to work for George Edmund Street. And I'm sure many of you at least know the outside of the law courts in the Strand. Possibly not so many of you know the interior, but I did explore the interior recently, and I was amazed how much I could see, but of course they don't allow you to take photographs as they are working law courts still. So to capture this great moment of the Oxford movement, as it's sometimes called, or the Cambridge ecclesiological movement, I show you a church by Henry Woodyere, who was an exact contemporary of Street's, and with very similar ideals, a passionate love of the Middle Ages, a passionate interest in reviving things like encaustic tile manufacturing. Look at those tiles, by the way. The design and manufacture of stained glass, which was improving by the day at that time in the 1850s and 60s, and even mural painting, painted decoration, such as you see over the chancel arch in the picture on the left. This is the Church of the Holy Innocents at Hynham in Gloucestershire, where I'm vice patron of the Friends, because at one time Thomas Gambier Parry, who was rather like the 9th Earl of Carlisle, he was a gentleman with ample means, but he was also a very, very gifted painter. And the mural paintings in this church are all by him. And he, working with Woodyere, created the perfect 19th century squire's Elysium. So the church, the parsonage house, the lodge, the school, and the church itself had magnificent metalwork, magnificent stained glass, mural paintings, wonderful textiles, a very important part of the arts and crafts movement from early in its development until late. It's a most magical place, and it's just west of Oxford, 2 miles west of Oxford if you're ever that way. And there's a friendly notice on the door saying where you can get the key, which is the rectory, bottom left. So interestingly enough, considering that he became so passionate about not using historical styles, Webb was also very friendly with another great Gothic revival architect whose work I've also always admired, William Butterfield, and used to dine with him regularly. And I discovered that myself because now many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I went and worked in the Arts and Crafts collection in the Cheltenham Art Gallery and Museum. And there they have Philip Webb's bookcases and many of his books. And I used to get locked into this room allowed out every 2 hours or so if I needed a breather. And I went through these books carefully, interested to see what they were, for one thing, of course. But very often I came across things that had been put into the books, probably by Webb. I don't know if you do this, but if I have a postcard I can't bear to throw away, I put it in a book and use it as a bookmarker, or just put it there, or a letter. And he did the same, and I found several postcards that said things like, "Dear Webb, Thursday evening would suit me perfectly. Come to dinner then. Yours, W.B., William Butterfield." And he lived not far from the British Museum in one of those nice Bloomsbury squares, and it was quite clear who they were from. So anyway, as you see, the interior of All Saints Margaret Street, which I'm sure some of you will have been in, is a bit like Heinum. It's, as it were, evoking the beauty of heaven through craftsmanship and art, embracing, again, wonderful tiles, painted decoration, textiles, and so on, and wonderful stained glass. And Butterfield was very into brick, as you see from the choir school building on the left. And Keble College, Oxford was designed by him, and there's also a wonderful essay in brick craftsmanship. Well, I've mentioned the law courts in the Strand as being by George Edmund Street, and although Webb kind of rebelled against Street's practice in terms of style, I think he was nevertheless very influenced by him, because, as I put there, Street was passionate about so many of the same things: stained glass, textiles, painted decoration, decorative metalwork, fine craftsmanship in every field. And equally, he had a strongly ethical attitude towards life and architecture. And if you've never explored the law courts, I really recommend it. Room after room is a masterpiece, frankly. And the central hall is like a cathedral. It is stone vaulted and it is superb. So anyway, Street had only established his office in Oxford in 1852, and Webb went there in 1853. And a couple of years later, a certain young William Morris, there is a really lovely representation of him as an eager young man, fancied being apprenticed to an architect, and went to be a pupil of George Edmund Street. And there are very interesting accounts of how unsuccessful it was. He found he wasn't really cut out to be an architect, and apparently he spent a lot of his time chatting and probably absorbing a great deal of wisdom and knowledge from Webb. And they also had a lot of fun together, as they did in later years too. And there's this remarkable description of Webb as a young man as being like a slim boy, like a wonderful bird just out of his shell, which seems to suit that portrait by Charles Fairfax Murray really well. In the testimonial or reference which John Billing wrote about Webb when he left him, he described him as being proficient in drawing, particularly in the several Gothic styles. But as I've already said sufficiently, he rebelled against that. But nevertheless, he rebelled against it from the position of knowledge. He knew how to design a Gothic window, and later he practiced very often designing stained glass for Gothic revival or even medieval Gothic windows. And similarly, he was very knowledgeable about classical styles to the extent that he was considered to be one of the founders of something which came to be known as the Queen Anne Revival. But look at these two images. Here you've got elements which are distinctly Gothic, but you've also got windows with segmental hood moulds which are distinctly classical. He was not afraid to use both. And what about this? This is the undercroft of Arisaig House in Inverness-shire, his only great house in Scotland, and still, in spite of a fire in the 1930s, a very fine building, and part of a great ensemble of Webb buildings. You couldn't describe that really as being Romanesque or classical, but it's using historical elements nevertheless. but he's not trying to be a revival architect in the way that both Street and Butterfield did. So what allowed him to go from Oxford to come to London to be his own man, to set up his own small practice? It was only ever very small, with one or at the most occasionally two assistants, was that Morris married Jane Burden, and they wanted a home. And so they asked Webb to design them a house. And this house, Red House in Bexley Heath, is considered to be one of the very influential houses of the mid-19th century. And as I've explained there, they went on a holiday together, and in the Baedeker, which they used, is a sketch, it's a Murray's Guide to France, and this is Letherby reporting. I find a hurried sketch by Webb of the staircase tower, that's in the middle, rising to two finials. It must be the first idea for the staircase projection at Red House, Bexley Heath, and that seems very likely. So Morris urged Webb to follow him to London, which he did. Webb took a room, a single room, at 7 Great Ormond Street. I've been to see it. It's a lovely early 18th century house, but later on he lived somewhere else, as I'll come to. And the drawings for Red House are completed by the following April. And Red House was ready for occupation by the summer of 1860. There's the original contract, which belongs to the William Morris Society, and there is one of its very distinguishing features, this rather wonderful well with its beautiful timber structure and its witch's cap of a covering. And the garden, incidentally, of Red House is considered to be one of the earliest and most important arts and crafts gardens. There became to be a great tradition of late 19th, very early 20th century gardens. And what was revolutionary about this house, considering it was the house for a gentleman and his wife, normally would have been built of stone. Here it was built of brick, handled with great virtuosity, but also growing out of the local vernacular to some extent. And how Morris and Webb and their friends decorated the house. There's beautiful tile work, as you see. There is much painted decoration, some by Webb. Webb is believed to have decorated the ceiling over the stair hall himself, I think. And fascinatingly, in the drawing room, left-hand photograph, since the National Trust came to own and manage the building and the garden, they've been uncovering more and more painted decoration. I go there about once a year, and it is really astonishing how much has been coming to light with the National Trust's curators and conservators. And there is, from the partial evidence, for example, on the ceiling of that room, there is much more to come. And I think the rediscovery of colour in architecture, the rediscovery of polychromy, is a very, very important thing that Webb and Morris and their closest friends like Burne-Jones and Rossetti and so on did. Of extraordinary interest and extent of survival is the stained glass in Red House, because Webb designed it himself. You see how pretty and charming it is. And because Morris and Company didn't then exist, it was made by a firm that they trusted, James Powell and Sons of Whitefriars Glassworks. And he even designed tableware in glass, which was also made by Powells of Whitefriars. And over very many years, I've been looking keenly in antique shops, because I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if one day I came across just one glass that was obviously designed by Philip Webb. But I never have. But I show it to you in case you do, because it would be very nice in the Barrows or somewhere like that to come across glass made to Webb's designs. They now have some in Red House. Of course, it didn't retain more than a few items of original furniture. And Kelmscott Manor, William Morris's country home, has more. So the piece on the left is a very difficult to remove, I imagine, piece of furniture that did survive the different changes in ownership and is still there. And the National Trust has been at pains to acquire other pieces. So this very, very fine table by Webb is one of their fairly recent acquisitions. And that's suitably enough in the dining room there. There is a selection of images of the garden. I think the bee is a very arts and crafts kind of creature somehow, you know, being very industrious, ingeniously making the interiors of hives and producing something which is delicious and local from that place. And by the way, when I worked for the National Trust for Scotland, in the first talk I ever gave there was to our head gardeners, and I said, I do wish we could keep bees in our walled gardens and have our own honey in our own shops. And the health and safety officer who was sitting in the front row was furious with me because he thought the bees would be very, very dangerous. But I have been to quite a few walled gardens open to the public where bees are kept, and I think there are ways of managing them. And I was very, very touched when about 3 years later I went to one of our gardens in the Borders, and the lady in the shop said, "Oh, Peter, there are 2 jars of honey here for you." And I got out my wallet to pay for them, and she said, "No, they're a gift, because apparently it was your idea to keep bees." So it just shows that dropping a pebble in the pool occasionally can be successful. I've already mentioned the importance of textiles, and to that one could add the thing that the Morris firm is almost most famous for, which is wallpapers of superb quality. And a few years ago, Christopher Ridgway, who is the curator and archivist at Castle Howard, put on the most wonderful exhibition of Morris and Company artifacts that belonged to Castle Howard. The wing that was burnt out during the Second World War, the East Wing, had been furnished by the Morris firm, and you know, nowadays we'd consider it a really catastrophic loss when it was burnt out in the Second World War, but at the time they said, oh, it was only 19th century things, not so important. But a lot of wallpapers never used came to light in a cupboard, and they have had for many years now in the chapel this beautiful screen of 3 saintly queens, which were embroidered, I believe, by Jane Morris, William Morris's wife. It was going to be a much larger screen, but at least 3 panels of it exist at Castle Howard. And there you see on the left some of these wallpapers in pristine condition and also stained glass. And this is, it's not very easy to see here, but this is the white on black design of lettering that Philip Webb evolved. And he did have a hand in some of the earlier wallpapers. So it's relevant to show them. Here I'm showing Worship Street again, because I feel I can't emphasize it enough, and the fact that it's so much at risk as it is at the present moment. But also, just to introduce the topic of Webb's patrons. And he belonged to, he wasn't very keen on belonging to things, but he did belong to a dining club, and through it he met this man, Major William James Gillam, who was wealthy, ex-army officer, and a philanthropist. And through him he designed a number of early works, including these fine houses and workshops. And this is to emphasize the poor condition of these lovely houses. And also, do you see where it has those huge letters, the UN? It doesn't stand for United Nations, but something much more alarming to do with making money. It's going to have an incredibly tall tower on that site. Construction is going on as we sit here. And that whole neighbourhood will be changed forever. So I'm really, really worried. And look at the condition. It's really appalling. And the way it's managed or mismanaged. Very sad. So anyway, we are in Scotland, so I can't not mention this evening Arisaig House again. I've just briefly mentioned it. There was the patron of that great building, Francis Dukenfield Palmer Astley, from which you will guess that he was really English. But he had land and mines in Cheshire, which gave them great wealth, and they bought this estate in Inverness-shire at Arisaig. And there were sisters, and as you see from the dates of birth and death, Francis Astley didn't live to a great age, but he had two sisters who survived him, and they remained Webb's friends always. So in these two photographs here, you have Arisaig on the garden side before the fire of the 1930s, and Arisaig after the fire, still recognisably the same house, but not put back precisely as it was. And this is the entrance side of the house, where the kitchen and scullery wing survives amazingly intact, and shows you something that I particularly love about Webb. He noticed that very often farm buildings have rounded corners in that part of Scotland, and so that was something that he wanted to use, and those very sweeping roofs, and a great mark of his, and not only his architecture, was these tremendously monumental chimneys. I once explained this to my mother, who was already very elderly, and after that, whenever we saw very tall chimneys, she would say, "Could it be by Webb?" Which I'm afraid was not always the case, but it was a happy thought. And then we were speaking before the meeting about the Bothy. This is the most beautiful house, the gardener's Bothy, which the owners I first met at Arisaig actually lived in themselves while they managed the main house as a hotel. And very typical of Webb is this kind of marvellous structure here with its beautiful, eloquent timber structures. And as you look at the great sweep of the roofs and all local materials, the stone quarried on the site, the stone slates brought from not far away, and so on. It's to my mind, as beautiful as the main house, if not more so. And these photographs show what a wonderful site it was built on, this great hill with very steep slopes. And Webb, presumably working closely with his patron, or perhaps it was mostly his idea, but he designed this great terraced garden, which you see in the top picture on the left. And from it you get this wonderful view of Arisaig Bay, which is incredibly like the beautiful drawing by Webb, which is reproduced in Lethaby's book. And here are some very characteristic details, some of which you can parallel. The way he caps a wall, for example, left-hand bottom slide is exactly like the wall at the Red House. And there's the game larder at the bottom, and this whole kitchen court was not damaged by the fire at all, and is so remarkably intact still. And I say that because I for many years, was given the impression there was nothing really left at all by Webb, and it was hardly worth going to, but it's by no means the case. And Adam Swan and I, you may well know him or know of him, but we are organising a weekend at Arisaig, the first weekend of October, where we hope to bring together in a sort of house party people who are really, really interested in Webb and would like to live, as it were, alongside him for a weekend, and we'll give papers to each other and explore Webb together a little more. But I find, in addition to the main house and its appendages, that the home farm, which is called Borrowdale, is, if anything, even more beautiful. It's an 18th century farmhouse at its core. It fell into dereliction, and when the estate came into the Astley hands, there was money to develop it. And so again, rather as at Standen, Webb designed 2 apartments, and to make sufficient accommodation, he designed these beautiful dormers. It's interesting, dormers, isn't it? In Edinburgh, where I live, as I mentioned, I walk down some streets and I'm wincing at every dormer, you know, but actually they can be very beautiful things. And in his hands they are. And this pentis, this little shelter he designed, and also this circular element here. And sadly, there was a fire here too, so what should be covered by wonderful west coast stone tiles is covered by some kind of metal roof covering, a huge and wonderful barn. And look, there is Webb using a Gothic element, but not like a Gothic revival architect. It's just one element among others, sort of giving it a feeling of the past somehow. But it's a most beautiful building, but it's also quite gaunt. And gaunt is a very favourite Webb word. And I've quoted something that he said there: I do love a gaunt church. And I found that myself. I've been to the most wonderful churches, say in Norfolk in England, these great barns of churches, and I've been really moved by their simplicity, their, if you like, their gauntness. And he's turned that idea into a very beautiful group of farm buildings, and especially the principal barn. Well, as we know, Francis Astley died relatively young, and quite often Webb remained friendly with the family. It wasn't only here, and the sisters asked him if he would design a suitable commemorative memorial to their brother, and it produced one of his best memorial designs, really very, very fine. It's a tiny burial ground, which is quite dominated by the stones commemorating different members of the Astley family. Typical of Webb, always wonderful lettering, as in this very long and very interesting inscription. And the most famous of all his memorials, though, is the one he designed for William Morris. And he said something very haunting about it. He said that he'd made a roof to keep the old man dry, or something like that. But a great deal of sadness went into these designs too, because they were in both cases very, very special friends. Morris, of course, in particular, but he was a man to whom friendship mattered a great deal. And for years I knew this design, but didn't actually go to the churchyard until a certain point in my life, now indeed a long time ago. But I noticed not far away was a 17th century memorial that was obviously the inspiration for it, a low coped stone on little stumpy legs. And Webb took that idea and made it into something which is really a masterpiece in miniature. Very, very beautiful. Another magnificent one enables me to introduce another important family name, namely the Bell family, the founder of whose 19th century fortunes was Sir Isaac Lowthian Bell. And here in East Rounton Churchyard, which is in North Yorkshire, very near Northallerton, is another of his magnificent churchyard memorials, a flat stone of great elaboration with wonderful inscriptions. And now here's the story. Here is an inscription. This is on the Arisaig Estate. And when I first saw it, I said to the owner of the building, that looks extraordinarily like Philip Webb's kind of design. And he was almost embarrassed by the thought, in grateful memory of Archibald MacDonald, teacher, parish school, Polnish school, and so on, 1856. On the Saturday morning, we actually found the drawing in the local museum, and it was exactly what you see there, but at the end, at the bottom right-hand corner, it said P.S.W., Philip Speakman Webb. And it was one of those goose pimple moments when you are absolutely humbled by finding something so special, and you can immediately relate it to the reality. So this building, the former school at Polnish, which is a parish within the Arisaig Estate, is going to be one of the foci of our weekend in October. Now here's an interesting thought. As Webb became better known, and as I've already mentioned, he was part of the second generation pre-Raphaelite circle, he designed quite a few houses for friends who were artists, or artists who were friends. And the first was for Valentine Prinsep, now number 14 Holland Park Road, which is a neighbourhood of wonderful 19th century houses. And in fact, in the left-hand photograph, you can just see the house of Lord Leighton, the great painter and president of the Royal Academy, the Arab Hall. But look carefully at that facade and look at the extraordinary elements, the asymmetry of it, the attenuated windows, the use of circular shapes, the way this bay projects out and so on. It's very, very carefully considered, isn't it? And then look at the east facade of a building well known in Glasgow. Very much the same elements. I'm really intrigued by this. It was a thought that literally occurred to me as I was making this talk, because I'd been invited to look around the fire-damaged parts of the Glasgow School of Art. And so I looked at it perhaps a bit more carefully, and I had just the week before been in London, and I thought, gosh, these two buildings have such a lot in common. And then I was also, at more or less the same time, at Standen. Again, these attenuated windows and these very original ways of treating recessed or brought forward window openings. What of Webb's work did Mackintosh know? Well, you may well know the answer to that, but I don't. But I think it's something to explore more thoroughly. Well, much more magnificent than that artist's house, or the other relatively modest ones, was the house that he designed for another very great friend, or rather pair of friends, George and Rosalind Howard. And as I've mentioned, George became the 9th Earl of Carlisle, but for his the previous Earl, who was his uncle, who was a very unwell man, lived for a very long time, so it was only in the last 2 decades of his life, really, that he was the Earl. But he was one of the trustees of the estates, nevertheless. And he wanted a house, he and Rosalind were very hospitable. They wanted a house in London. They built in what I think today must be called Billionaires Row, that road on the west side of Kensington Palace, number 1 Palace Green. And together with Webb and the other members of the circle, they created the most wonderful interiors. And sad to say, I understand that it was all converted rather ruthlessly in the 1950s. It reverted to the Crown Commissioners and they turned the building into apartments. It's a very difficult building to study outside or in. Obviously, it's very difficult to get in, but even when I tried to photograph the outside, a man appeared literally with a machine gun and said, "What are you doing?" Because the next door building is the Israeli embassy, and there are such sensitivities there. But actually, when I told my story, he kind of protected me while I took a few nervous photographs. But these photographs do give a hint of the splendor of those rooms. And the dining room was apparently particularly wonderful, with paintings partly by Burne-Jones. Here's the famous quote that I mentioned earlier by Ruskin: "I'm happy to tell you of an architect, Mr. Philip Webb, 7 Great Ormond Street, who will give you perfectly sound and noble work for absolutely just price." Isn't that amazing? Wonderful praise. Well, for Lowthian Bell, he built the head house of the estate, Rounton Grange, about which I'll say a little more in a moment, but also for his son, Hugh Bell, Thomas Hugh Bell. He designed a house which you see up there called Red Barns. I'm very anxious about this. These photographs were taken on the visit we made during the conference all those years ago in 1996. This one more recently. But at the moment it is also being turned into apartments. Now, a former MA student of mine at York has been the conservation officer monitoring this, and I met him in the street in Edinburgh about a month ago, and he said, "I promise you we've done everything we can to preserve Webb's interiors, but I'm eager to know what the reality of that may be." But let's hope he's right. But it's a real shame that in this centenary year so many, 2 at least, of Webb's second tier but still important buildings are at risk. Well, I think I've touched on the fact that the Howard family also had this other major estate in Cumbria. It should be even now the seat of the Earl of Carlisle, but his younger brother Philip lives there and manages that estate. And for the factor of the estate, Webb designed this wonderful house, it's called Four Gables, and it kind of grows out of the idea of a northwest basal or fortified house. Very beautiful it is. He also designed a more modest house for the vicar called the Vicar's House rather than the Vicarage, now an old people's home. And the top four photographs are of Naworth Castle, the Earl's seat. George Washington Jack, who was Webb's final assistant and a very, very special person too, he designed that rather wonderful seat which you see in the second photograph on the left. And Webb didn't do a lot of work at Naworth. He advised them, and he also designed an apartment for Rosalind at the top of one of the towers, the Morpeth Tower, because she was the sort of lady who liked to read books and do her embroidery, and she sought tranquility in a busy life from time to time, and so that was something he did for her. But as I transcribed all the letters in the Castle Howard archives, 185 of them from Webb, and I was amazed to find that he fell out with them big time. And it was because Rosalind in particular wanted to add a bachelor's wing, because this was the time when people liked to have these very political house parties, and so they needed lots of bedrooms. And in order to achieve what she wanted to achieve, it meant knocking a hole into a medieval wall, and Webb said there must be another way. And he came back some months later, and he found that they had nevertheless done it, and he was so hurt that he went for a very, very long ride on his horse, or their horse probably, one of their horses, and he wrote to them afterwards and said, "I'll still be your friend, but I can't be your architect." Wasn't that a shame? But it was their fault. And finally, in the town, Brampton, which is the estate town, he designed one of the three churches or chapels he designed, and the only church that got built, St. Martin's, Brampton. And it is a very subtle and very interesting building, but one of its great treasures is 18 windows by the Morris firm, mostly designed by Burne-Jones. And this is just a detail of the east window. You can see how rich and magnificent it is. By the way, I hesitated about the number of chapels because I actually glimpsed the other ecclesiastical building he designed. One of William Morris's sisters became a Mrs. Gilmore, and she founded an Anglican order for women called the Deaconess Community of St. Andrew. It was really very important at the time, as it kind of set a standard for women's ministry in the Episcopal Church. And they had a house on the north side of Clapham Common, and Webb designed a chapel for them, and I've always known of its existence. But literally a month ago, I stayed a couple of nights with a friend in that part of Clapham, and she was out the second morning, and I thought, well, I'll just go and see if I can find this chapel. And I found that because of the development around it, I could just see an end from one street, and then I went to the other side street, and I could just see the other end. But according to the Buildings of England volume for South London, all the furniture survives. And there is a particularly wonderful altar frontal, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was designed for that chapel. So this is the great loss of Webb's buildings to date, and let's hope there won't be any more of them. This is Rounton Grange, the house of the estate assembled by Sir Isaac Lowthian Bell, and it's the house where Morris was painting a ceiling. There's a story that's quite famous to do with William Morris. Morris was painting this ceiling, and he kind of worked himself up into a great state and was shouting, and the host, Lowthian Bell, went to see what was happening, and he said, "What's the matter, Morris?" And he said, "Well, it's just that I spend all my life designing and making things for the swinish rich," which was a bit much since it was probably just before lunchtime or something like that. But you could understand, Morris had these great ideals about making good design and good workmanship available to, as it were, everybody, but actually only people who had quite a lot of money could afford it. It's a dilemma we still, in a sense, live with. Anyway, during the Second World War and after, it was used as the focus of a prisoner of war camp, and I expect it was in a rather terrible state, and the Bell family had and still have and live in a very nice Queen Anne house in one of the other parishes, and so they retreated to that, the parents of the present baronet, and so Rounton Grange was demolished bit by bit. A horrific story, isn't it? I mean, now we would so treasure it. And some of the Philip Webb furniture that survives, which is knocking around elsewhere and has come to be in Red House or Kelmscott Manor or elsewhere, does in fact come from a very rich assemblage of furniture that there was here. But the thing I think I would most like to have seen there was the fantastic garden buildings designed by Webb. Look at that in the middle, the great conservatory. I mean, it's as magnificent as Chatsworth, isn't it? But of the 1860s, all lost. And here are some happy photographs from the family photograph albums, which I was lent for a while, so that I could copy some of them. This is the Philip Webb boathouse, just a wreck. However, the younger generation are very keen on the Philip Webb buildings, and buildings also by George Washington Jack. And this is the home farm, and with a lovely row of cottages, and the farm manager's house and the barns, all by Webb, still in good condition. And the barns are gradually being turned into one of those centres where you can buy really good local food, where you can have a really slow food kind of lunch, where there's plenty of parking, and it's actually been done really, really well. And I think this is, as an alternative to demolition or butchering the buildings, a fantastically good solution. I mean, look at that roof structure, how superb it is. It's as good as a church, isn't it? It's really very fine for a barn. A slightly sadder story is what's happened to the coach house and the apartment for the coach driver, which was above it, which does survive fairly intact, and the stables for the horses that went with the carriages. This has all been recently rather sanitized in the way that you see in the two pictures below. Where this courtyard is was another of those great conservatory-like roofs, which I knew in decay, where the carriages were washed down and where they were stored when not in use. But it's still quite a beautiful building, not quite as beautiful as I remember it. And there is a really nice photograph of the house, and I show it because I love this quotation from Alfred Pole, who was yet another young architect whom Webb encouraged. I remember it standing up over the trees with 4 great chimneys, there they are, and a wonderful smile about its front to the garden. It had the unobtrusive rightness of Webb's common sense. One only where, as he once said, when I asked help of him. Isn't that lovely? A wonderful smile about its facade. I like that. But Sir Lowthian Bell, the founder of the dynasty, spent years and eventually succeeded in persuading his neighbour to sell him Mount Grace Priory, which was, decaying fast. And he spent a lot of money on employing a really good architect called Ambrose Poynter and repairing the ruins and turning the prior's lodging into a very pleasant country house. This is all currently in the guardianship, not ownership, of English Heritage, and they have recently refurnished a number of the rooms with good arts and crafts, mostly Morris and Company, or some Morris and Company furniture and suitable artifacts, including borrowing that wonderful carpet, Morris carpet, from the Bell family. So it's being very much honoured at the present time. It's one of my favourite ancient places, I must say. I love stopping there. And also for the Bell family firm, Webb designed his only factory, which was called the Clarence Works, which has disappeared, and also their head office building, which is in Middlesbrough and survives. And something I've always loved about Webb's particular language is this kind of checkerboard pattern which you see on the staircase and which you sometimes see also reflected in furniture. I say this rather diffidently. So this is a settee by Ernest Jimson, which I caught in the great exhibition of Jimson furniture in Leicester a few years ago. So thinking of retirement, as we must now be thinking of a glass of wine, Webb explored the well, I am anyway. Webb explored the possibility of going to live in or near Sapperton, which is near Cirencester, with Ernest Jimson and other members of his younger circle of SPAB and arts and crafts friends, who really thought of themselves as his disciples. But nowhere suitable appeared, and so out of the blue really, but apparently greatly encouraged by Sidney Cockerell, Wilfrid Scarwen Blunt, that very fascinating man, landowner, politician, poet, extremely good poet, and campaigner for Home Rule in Ireland and much else besides, he offered Webb this farmhouse called Caxton's. And there it is again, you saw it at the very beginning, charming, lovely house. And on one day, lovely day in 1901, after John Brandon Jones's death, his widow unveiled a plaque commemorating Philip Webb's residence there, because it was the centenary of the date that he moved to West Sussex. And then we went to Standen and had a lovely lunch, and then I gave a talk, and we had a very, very happy Webb day, which I hope there will be many more this year. He continued to be a member of the SPAB committee, though he didn't actually go to meetings from 1901 onwards, but members of the committee, including these young men who drew so much inspiration from him, came down to spend the day or longer with him. And I want to end by mentioning how special these friends were. George Washington Jack I've mentioned before, and there was a very good exhibition of his work a few years ago at the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow, and William Richard Letherby, who, as I said from the very beginning, wrote so movingly and beautifully and accurately and sensitively about him, and what I call the ever solicitous Sidney Cockerell, who was one of his executors. And once I allowed myself 3 days working in the West Sussex Record Office, and I didn't know what had happened, whether Webb was buried or cremated or what. And at the very end of this period of 3 days, I asked for a file, really on hunch more than anything else, and it came with just three, I think, pieces of paper in it. And one was a typed letter from Sidney Cockerell to Wilfrid Scarwen Blunt, dated something or other 1915, and it said, "Dear Emery Walker and I went yesterday and scattered Philip's ashes on the White Horse in the Vale of the White Horse." And I nearly broke down and cried, because if one thing, it was the answer of a mystery to me, I just didn't know. And he told it so simply and so beautifully. So there we are. I hope you know a bit more about Webb than you did at the beginning. In one or two cases, I know there is an expertise at least as great as mine, if not greater. But I have been for many years now passionate about him. He is well worthy of our attention. And in this centenary year, I hope you will help me make him better known and better appreciated. And there are other aspects of his work, but I think we have to remember him for two things. His honesty of construction, which was so influential on other architects, and his a-stylar manner of design, and also his very skillful repair of old buildings, on which I have written a whole chapter in a book, so you could read more about that, all right. And through the SPAB, we're very anxious that people should know more about Webb and his very special qualities. Thank you very much for being here.